An elderly woman passed away and never told her children about the savings she had hidden away. When her son uncovered the truth, he found himself caught in a bitter legal battle with his estranged daughter. The stale scent of cedar and mothballs filled the attic as Livia Cross hoisted the final box of her mother's belongings onto the creaky wooden floor. Sunlight streamed through a single dusty window, illuminating the cluttered space. Livia knelt, her hands trembling as she opened a box marked Keepsakes. Beneath the faded photographs and brittle envelopes, her fingers brushed against something solid. A moment later, she unearthed an old tin canister, its lid sealed with decades of dust. Curiosity gnawed at her. She pried the lid open, revealing bundles of cash wrapped in yellowed paper. Livia froze, staring at the small fortune in disbelief. She counted quickly. Tens, 20s, and even crisp hundreds. Her breath caught in her throat when the total surpassed $250,000. Her mother, Elara Wynne, had never spoken of savings. They'd lived modestly in this worn-down house for years. Questions swirled in her mind. Why would Elara keep this secret? And why hide the money instead of depositing it in a bank? Livia glanced around the attic, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her chest. She thought of her son, Callan Frost, now entering his first year of college. This money could ease their struggles, give Callan opportunities he'd only dreamed of. But as she stared at the cash, another thought crept in. Her estranged daughter, Serafina Dawn, had every reason to stake a claim. The funeral had been a muted affair. Livia lingered near the grave as the crowd dispersed, offering condolences and promises of support. The tension in her chest eased slightly when she saw Callan standing by her car, his lanky frame hunched against the wind. He'd always been her rock, even as a child. Now, as an adult, his loyalty remained unwavering, but her relief evaporated when she spotted Serafina approaching. She hadn't seen her daughter in 3 years. Serafina's tall, imposing figure was wrapped in a sharp black coat, her polished heels crunching on the gravel path. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had long since abandoned sentimentality. "Livia," Serafina said, her voice clipped. She avoided the title Mom, as if it tasted sour on her tongue. "Serafina," Livia replied, keeping her tone neutral. The years of estrangement hung between them like a wall neither could scale. "I'm not here to fight," Serafina said, though her sharp gaze suggested otherwise. "But we need to talk about Grandma's estate." Livia stiffened. "There isn't much to talk about. The house and her personal belongings are all that's left." "Is that so?" Serafina's eyebrow arched. "I find it hard to believe Grandma didn't leave anything behind. She always told me she was saving up for something big." Livia's heart raced. Could Serafina somehow know about the hidden money? She feigned ignorance. "Your grandmother never mentioned anything like that to me." Serafina smirked, a cold, calculated expression. "Funny, she mentioned it to me. I'm entitled to half of whatever's left, and I intend to claim it." Livia's hands balled into fists. "This isn't the time or place for this conversation." Serafina shrugged. "Then you'll hear from my lawyer." She turned on her heel, leaving Livia fuming. Callan approached cautiously, his brow furrowed. "What was that about?" "Nothing," Livia lied, her voice brittle. "Just Serafina being Serafina." That evening, Livia sat at the kitchen table, staring at the tin canister now hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She couldn't shake the image of Serafina's smirk. What right did she have to demand anything? Serafina had left years ago, blaming Livia for every hardship in her life. Livia had raised Callan alone, scraping by with no help from her daughter, who had been consumed by ambition. As Livia wrestled with her thoughts, the phone rang. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" "Livia, it's me," Serafina's sharp voice came through the line. "I've already started the paperwork. My lawyer will be in touch soon." "Serafina, you don't even know what you're fighting for," Livia snapped. "I know enough. Grandma had assets, and I have every right to my share." Livia's grip tightened on the phone. "You haven't been part of this family in years. Don't act like you care now." A bitter laugh echoed from the other end. "This isn't about family, Livia. It's about fairness. If you think you can keep everything for yourself, think again." Serafina hung up, leaving Livia seething. The bitterness between them had festered for years, but this was a new low. Livia stared at the phone, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let Serafina bully her into giving up what her mother had hidden away. Days later, Livia met with an attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Talia Moon. As Livia explained the situation, Talia's sharp mind worked through the details. "The problem is," Talia said, "without a will explicitly stating how the assets are to be divided, Serafina could make a legitimate claim." "She abandoned this family," Livia argued. "She doesn't deserve a dime." Talia adjusted her glasses. "That may be true, but the law doesn't take emotions into account. If this goes to court, it could get ugly." Livia's stomach churned. She'd always been a fighter, but the idea of dragging her family's dirty laundry into a courtroom filled her with dread. Still, she refused to let Serafina win. That night, as Livia prepared for bed, she received a text from Callan. "Mom, I think you should give her something. She's still family." Livia stared at the message, her chest tightening. Callan's words stung. Did he not understand everything she'd sacrificed to protect this family? She typed a curt response. "It's not that simple." But as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, doubt crept in. Was she letting her anger at Serafina cloud her judgment? Or was this money her last chance to secure the life she and Callan deserved? Livia's indecision came to a head the next morning when a certified letter arrived at her door. She tore it open to find a formal notice of legal action filed by Serafina's lawyer. Livia's anger flared as she read the words, but beneath the rage was a flicker of fear. If she lost this battle, she could lose everything. She called Talia immediately. "We're going to fight," she said, her voice firm. Talia's response was cautious. "Are you sure? Once we start, there's no turning back." "I'm sure," Livia said. "Serafina doesn't get to waltz in here and take what isn't hers." As Livia hung up, she glanced at the loose floorboard where the tin canister remained hidden. She knew this fight would cost her, emotionally, financially, and perhaps even more. But she also knew she couldn't let Serafina win. The stage was set for a battle that would test the limits of family, loyalty, and justice. And as Livia prepared for the fight of her life, she couldn't shake the feeling that the money her mother had hidden away was more than just a secret. It was a curse. Livia Cross stood in her kitchen, the faint smell of coffee lingering as the morning sun filtered through the window. The tin canister sat hidden under the floorboards in the living room, its presence as heavy as a ghost in the house. She couldn't stop replaying her phone call with Serafina. Every sharp word echoed in her mind, fueling her anger. Callan Frost entered the kitchen, his face flushed from an early run. He grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter. You look like you didn't sleep at all, Mom, he said, concern etched across his face. I didn't, Livia admitted, her voice flat. Your sister's making my life hell, as usual. Callan sighed, his usual calm demeanor barely masking his frustration. She's not going to stop, is she? She's already filed legal action, Livia said, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Your grandmother never left a will, so this whole mess is going to court. Callan's eyes widened. You're really going to fight her? What choice do I have? Livia snapped. She's not entitled to a penny of that money. She walked out on this family years ago. Now all of a sudden she cares because there's something in it for her? Callan shifted uncomfortably. I'm not saying she's right. I just don't want this to tear us apart even more than it already has. Livia's shoulders sagged. She wanted to protect Callan from the ugliness of the situation, but she also needed him to understand what was at stake. I'm doing this for you, she said softly. That money could change your life, Callan. It could pay for school, give you a real future. Callan nodded, but didn't look convinced. I get it, Mom. I just hope it's worth it. Later that day, Livia met with her lawyer, Talia Moon, at her small downtown office. The air inside smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and the walls were lined with bookshelves overflowing with legal texts. Talia sat behind a large oak desk, her expression as unreadable as ever. Serafina's lawyer is aggressive, Talia said, sliding a stack of papers across the desk. They're claiming half of everything, including the house. The house? Livia's voice rose. She hasn't set foot in that house in years. It doesn't matter, Talia said firmly. Without a will, the law doesn't care about family dynamics. They'll argue that she's entitled to an equal share of all assets. Livia gritted her teeth. What are my chances of winning? Talia hesitated. It depends on how far they're willing to push. If they can prove that the money was part of your mother's estate and not a gift or something you contributed to, then things could get tricky. So what do I do? We fight back, Talia said, her tone confident. But you need to be prepared for this to get ugly. They're going to dig into your life, your finances, your relationship with Serafina. Everything. Livia swallowed hard. She had nothing to hide, but the thought of her family's private struggles becoming public was almost unbearable. As Livia left the office, her phone buzzed with a text from Serafina. You're making a mistake. This doesn't have to be a fight. Livia stared at the message, her blood boiling. Too late for that, she typed back, before shoving her phone into her purse. That evening, Callan found her in the living room, staring at the spot where the tin canister was hidden. He sat down beside her, his face serious. Mom, do you think Grandma would want this? Livia sighed. I don't know, Callan. She was so secretive about everything. I didn't even know she had that money until after she died. Maybe there's a reason she didn't tell anyone, Callan said. Maybe she didn't want it to cause problems. Well, it's a little late for that now, Livia said bitterly. Callan placed a hand on her shoulder. Whatever happens, I'm with you. Just don't let this destroy you, okay? Livia nodded, though she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. The next morning, Livia woke to find an envelope slipped under her door. She opened it cautiously, her heart pounding. Inside was a copy of the legal complaint Serafina had filed, along with a note scrawled in Serafina's sharp handwriting. We don't have to do this the hard way. Call me. Livia crumpled the note in her hand, her jaw tightening. Serafina's attempts to intimidate her only strengthened her resolve. She picked up her phone and dialed Talia. They're trying to rattle me, Livia said when Talia answered. That's standard practice, Talia said calmly. They want you to second-guess yourself, maybe even back down. Don't give them the satisfaction. I won't, Livia said. Let's move forward. The next week was a blur of meetings, paperwork, and sleepless nights. Livia pored over old documents, trying to piece together any evidence that could strengthen her case. She found receipts for home repairs, utility bills, and other expenses she had covered over the years. Talia assured her that these would help show that she had been the primary caretaker of the house and its upkeep. Meanwhile, Serafina's legal team was relentless. They subpoenaed bank records, questioned neighbors, and even reached out to old family friends. The tension between Livia and Serafina grew with each passing day, their phone calls devolving into shouting matches until Livia finally stopped answering. One evening, as Livia sat alone in the living room, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Serafina standing on the porch, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" Serafina asked. Livia hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. Serafina walked into the living room and sat down, her eyes scanning the familiar space. "It hasn't changed much," she said, her tone neutral. Livia sat across from her, her arms folded. "What do you want, Serafina?" "I want to end this," Serafina said. "This fight is tearing us apart, and for what? Money? It's not worth it." "You started this fight," Livia shot back. "You're the one dragging me to court." "I wouldn't have had to if you'd been willing to talk to me," Serafina said, her voice rising. "But you've always shut me out, Mom, ever since I was a kid." Livia felt a pang of guilt, but pushed it aside. "You walked away from this family, Serafina. You don't get to play the victim now." Serafina sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I'm not here to fight. I just want to figure out a way to move forward." Livia studied her daughter's face, searching for sincerity. For a moment, she considered the possibility of compromise, but the years of hurt and betrayal were too fresh. "I'll think about it," Livia said finally. Serafina nodded, though her expression suggested she didn't believe her. "Let me know before it's too late." As Serafina left, Livia felt a flicker of doubt. Was she doing the right thing by holding her ground, or was she letting pride and anger guide her decisions? The next morning, Livia received an email from Talia with updates on the case. The legal battle was escalating, and the court date was approaching fast. Livia knew she had to be prepared for whatever came next, but the weight of the fight was beginning to take its toll. As she stared at the tin canister hidden beneath the floorboards, she couldn't help but wonder if her mother had foreseen this chaos. Had Alara hidden the money to protect it, or had she known it would only bring trouble? Livia didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. She wasn't backing down. Livia Cross sat in her living room, the house eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The tin canister beneath the floorboards seemed to weigh heavier on her mind with each passing day. She stared at the untouched coffee cup in her hands, her thoughts racing. The court date was set for 2 weeks away, and Serafina had doubled down on her demands. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Livia hesitated before answering, her stomach tightening as she saw Serafina's name on the screen. She debated letting it go to voicemail, but reluctantly picked up. "What now, Serafina?" Livia said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm calling to give you one last chance to settle," Serafina said. "We can avoid court if you just agree to split the money. 50-50. No lawyers, no mess." Livia's grip on the phone tightened. "You don't get to dictate terms after dragging me into this. You've made it clear you're willing to fight for every penny." "And you're not?" Serafina shot back. "You think you're the only one with a right to that money? Grandma wouldn't have wanted this, Mom. She wouldn't want us at each other's throats over something so stupid. She also wouldn't have wanted you to show up after years of silence acting like you're owed something, Livia said, her voice trembling with anger. Fine, Serafina said coldly. I'll see you in court. The line went dead, and Livia slammed the phone onto the table. She stared at it for a long moment, her chest heaving with frustration. The conversation replayed in her mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. Later that evening, Callan Frost returned home, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He paused in the doorway, noticing the tension in Livia's posture. Another fight with Serafina? He asked, dropping his bag onto a chair. She called to make me an offer, Livia said. 50-50, no lawyers. I said no. Callan frowned, sitting across from her. Mom, are you sure you're doing the right thing? Maybe splitting it would be easier. Livia's eyes narrowed. Easier? After everything she's put us through? She doesn't deserve a dime, Callan. She's only doing this because she knows how much we need that money. Callan leaned back, his expression thoughtful. But what if this fight ends up costing more than the money itself? Lawyers aren't cheap, and court cases can drag on for months. Livia pressed her palms to her temples, her frustration mounting. I know that. But if I give in now, what kind of message does that send? That she can walk all over us whenever she wants? It's not about sending a message, Callan said gently. It's about moving on. Don't let this money destroy what's left of our family. His words lingered long after he left the room. Livia paced the living room, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She hated the idea of giving Serafina anything, but Callan's plea for peace gnawed at her resolve. The next day, Livia met with her lawyer, Talia Moon, to review their strategy. The office felt more oppressive than usual, the weight of the case pressing down on Livia's shoulders. We have a strong argument, Talia said, sliding a folder across the desk. You've been the primary caretaker of the house and the family finances for years. That works in your favor. But, Livia prompted, sensing the hesitation in Talia's tone. But Serafina's legal team is building a compelling case. They're focusing on the fact that the money was hidden in your mother's house, which makes it part of her estate. Without a will, that gives Serafina equal claim. Livia's heart sank. So, what are my chances? Talia hesitated before answering. It's hard to say. The judge could rule in your favor, but there's no guarantee. If you're open to negotiating, now might be the time. Livia shook her head, her jaw set. I'm not giving up. Not to her. Talia nodded, though her expression remained guarded. Then we'll keep fighting. As the days passed, the tension between Livia and Serafina reached a boiling point. They avoided direct contact, communicating only through their lawyers. Each new piece of evidence or legal maneuver felt like a personal attack, deepening the rift between them. One evening, Callan found Livia in the attic, surrounded by boxes of old family photos and documents. She was searching for anything that could strengthen her case, her hands trembling with exhaustion. Mom, this has to stop, Callan said, his voice firm but kind. You're tearing yourself apart over this. I can't stop, Livia said, her voice breaking. If I let her win, everything I've worked for will be for nothing. It's not about winning or losing, Callan said. It's about finding a way to move forward. Grandma wouldn't want you to destroy yourself over this. Livia's shoulders sagged as she sank onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to do, Callan. I feel like I'm losing everything. Callan knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. You're not losing me. No matter what happens, we'll figure it out together. The court date loomed closer, and Livia's anxiety grew with each passing day. She spent hours preparing with Talia, reviewing documents, and practicing her testimony. The fight had consumed every aspect of her life, leaving little room for anything else. On the morning of the hearing, Livia stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blazer and smoothing her hair. Her reflection stared back at her, weary but determined. Callan waited for her downstairs, offering a reassuring smile as she grabbed her bag and headed for the door. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Livia avoided looking at Serafina, who sat across the room with her lawyer. The judge entered, and the hearing began. Talia presented their case with precision, emphasizing Livia's role as the primary caretaker and the financial sacrifices she had made over the years. Serafina's lawyer countered with arguments about the hidden money being part of the estate, painting Serafina as a victim of Livia's unwillingness to share. As the proceedings dragged on, Livia found herself questioning everything. Was she fighting for justice, or was she letting her pride blind her to the bigger picture? When the judge called a recess, Livia stepped outside to clear her head. She found Serafina smoking a cigarette near the courthouse steps, her expression unreadable. "Didn't think you'd still have that habit," Livia said, surprising herself. Serafina shrugged, exhaling a plume of smoke. Some things don't change. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. Finally, Serafina spoke. "You know, this isn't how I wanted things to go." "Could have fooled me," Livia said, her tone bitter. "I'm serious," Serafina said. "I don't want to keep fighting, but I also don't want to feel like I'm being erased from this family." Livia looked at her daughter, seeing the vulnerability beneath her hardened exterior. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of empathy. "We both made mistakes," Livia said quietly. "Maybe it's time we start fixing them." Serafina nodded, her eyes misting over. "Maybe." As they returned to the courtroom, Livia felt a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she saw a path forward. One that didn't end with both of them broken. The courthouse felt colder the second time Livia Cross walked in, flanked by her lawyer, Talia Moon, and her son, Callan Frost. Though the initial hearing hadn't yielded a definitive ruling, the tension between Livia and Serafina Dawn had only grown more palpable. The case now hinged on the judge's interpretation of the law. Was the hidden money part of Alara Wynn's estate, or did Livia have a valid claim based on her years of caregiving and financial sacrifice? As they entered the courtroom, Livia caught a glimpse of Serafina sitting with her lawyer, her expression sharp but composed. The sight of her daughter felt like a punch to the gut. Livia had spent sleepless nights replaying their confrontation on the courthouse steps. For a fleeting moment, they had almost found common ground, but Serafina's resolve to claim her fair share had only deepened since then. "Stay focused," Talia whispered as they took their seats. "The evidence is on our side. Don't let her rattle you." Livia nodded, though her hands trembled as she adjusted her papers. Callan sat beside her, his reassuring presence a steady anchor. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. Serafina's lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Cale Drake, opened with a statement that immediately set Livia on edge. "This case is about fairness, Your Honor. My client, Serafina Dawn, is simply asking for her rightful share of her grandmother's estate, a request rooted in both law and morality." Livia clenched her jaw as Cale continued, weaving a narrative that painted Serafina as the wronged party, unfairly excluded from a family inheritance. When he produced a series of old letters Alara had written to Serafina, Livia's stomach dropped. The letters spoke of Alara's dreams of saving money for the future, a future she hoped would include both of her grandkids. Kael handed the letters to the judge, glancing pointedly at Livia. These letters demonstrate that Alara Wynne intended her savings to benefit her entire family, not just one individual. Talia stood next, her presence commanding. Your Honor, the issue here isn't intent. It's contribution. My client, Livia Cross, devoted her life to caring for her mother and maintaining the family home. She took on financial burdens, sacrificing her own opportunities to ensure her mother's well-being. This money represents a lifetime of shared responsibility, not a free-for-all inheritance. As Talia spoke, Livia felt a surge of gratitude for her lawyer's tenacity. But the courtroom battle was far from over. Kael's cross-examination was ruthless, probing into Livia's finances and decisions with relentless precision. Ms. Cross, Kael said, his tone dripping with feigned politeness. Can you explain why your mother never disclosed this money to you, despite your claim of being her primary caretaker? Livia hesitated, her mouth dry. My mother was a private person. She didn't share everything with me. Yet you believe this money belongs to you, despite having no direct knowledge of its existence until after her passing? Livia's voice wavered. I believe it belongs to the person who made sacrifices to keep this family together. Kael smiled, a predator sensing weakness. And yet, your daughter, my client, also made sacrifices. She faced hardships while you were focused on your son. Isn't it fair to say that both parties have endured struggles? The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Livia grappled with her response. Struggles don't entitle someone to take what isn't theirs. Kael nodded, his expression neutral. No further questions, Your Honor. When the court adjourned for the day, Livia felt as if she'd run a marathon. Her hands shook as she gathered her papers, avoiding Serafina's gaze. Callan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his quiet support a balm to her frayed nerves. You held your ground, Talia said, as they exited the courtroom. That's all that matters. But as they stepped outside, Serafina approached, her expression unreadable. Can we talk? She asked, her voice low. Livia hesitated, glancing at Talia. The lawyer gave a subtle nod, signaling that it was safe to engage. Callan stayed back, watching the interaction with wary eyes. What do you want, Serafina? Livia asked, her tone guarded. I wanted to say... Serafina trailed off, her confidence faltering. Look, I know this isn't easy for either of us, but you have to understand, I'm not trying to hurt you. I just want what's fair. Fair. Livia's voice rose, years of pent-up frustration bubbling to the surface. You think fairness means swooping in after all these years and demanding a share of something you didn't work for? I'm not saying you didn't work hard, Serafina snapped, her composure slipping. But Grandma always talked about taking care of family. That includes me, whether you like it or not. Livia took a step closer, her voice trembling with emotion. You left this family, Serafina. You turned your back on us when we needed you most, and now you expect me to just hand over what little we have left? Serafina's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her expression hardened. I didn't leave because I didn't care. I left because I couldn't stay in a house where I felt like I didn't matter. The words hit Livia like a blow, her anger momentarily giving way to guilt. She opened her mouth to respond, but Serafina shook her head, cutting her off. This fight isn't just about money, Serafina said quietly. It's about respect, and maybe that's something we'll never have. She turned and walked away, leaving Livia standing in the shadow of the courthouse, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. That evening, Livia sat in the kitchen, staring at the tin canister she had finally retrieved from its hiding place. The bundles of cash inside seemed to mock her, their presence a reminder of the chaos they had unleashed. She thought about Serafina's words, the pain in her daughter's voice. For the first time, Livia wondered if she had been too focused on her own struggles to see the hurt she had caused others. Callan entered, his expression cautious. "How did it go with Serafina?" Livia sighed, pushing the canister aside. "It didn't. She's still convinced she's entitled to this money." Callan pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Maybe she has a point." Livia looked up sharply. "Not you too." "I'm not saying she's right," Callan said quickly. "But maybe there's a way to meet her halfway. This fight is tearing you apart, Mom. It's not worth losing everything over." Livia's shoulders sagged, the weight of the conflict pressing down on her. "I don't know if I can trust her, Callan. Every time I think we might find common ground, she pushes me further away." "Maybe it's not about trust," Callan said. "Maybe it's about letting go." The words stayed with Livia as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. She thought about her mother, about the sacrifices she had made and the secrets she had kept. What would Alara have wanted? Would she have fought tooth and nail to keep the money? Or would she have found a way to bring her family back together? As the moonlight filtered through the window, Livia made a decision. She didn't know if it was the right one, but it was the only path forward she could see. The fight wasn't over, but maybe it didn't have to be a war. The morning sun rose sluggishly, casting a dull light over Livia Cross's small living room. She sat at the table, the tin canister open in front of her. The stacks of cash inside had long lost their gleam in her eyes. They felt more like shackles than salvation now. She could feel Callan watching her from the kitchen doorway, his unspoken words weighing as heavily as her own thoughts. "Mom," he finally said, stepping closer, "have you thought about what you're going to do?" Livia closed the lid of the canister and rubbed her temples. "I don't know, Callan. I thought I was ready to fight this out in court, but now—" Her voice trailed off, thick with hesitation. Callan pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You don't have to decide today, but you need to ask yourself if this is worth it. Not just the money, everything that comes with it." Livia nodded, but didn't respond. Her thoughts were a storm of conflicting emotions. On one hand, the money represented years of sacrifice and struggle, a chance to finally give Callan the life he deserved. On the other hand, every step of this legal battle had driven a deeper wedge between her and Serafina, and the cost of that rift was becoming harder to ignore. When Livia arrived at Talia Moon's office later that day, her lawyer's usual air of confidence seemed tinged with caution. Talia gestured for Livia to sit, then slid a new document across the desk. "Serafina's team has proposed a mediation," Talia said, her tone neutral. "It's not a settlement, but it's a step in that direction. They're offering to split the money 70-30, with you keeping the larger share." Livia's eyes widened. 70-30? After everything they've put me through, they think I'll just hand over 30%? Talia raised a hand, her expression calm. "It's not ideal, but it's an opportunity to avoid a prolonged court battle. If we go to trial, you risk losing more than 30%. Judges can be unpredictable, especially without a will to back your claim." Livia stared at the document, her stomach churning. The idea of giving Serafina any of the money felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked for. But the thought of dragging the fight through court with no guarantee of victory was equally unappealing. What happens if I refuse? Livia asked. Talia sighed. Then we go to trial as planned. But you need to understand. Serafina's team will come at you with everything they've got. They'll dig into your finances, your parenting, even your relationship with your mother. It won't be pretty. Livia leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She thought about Callan's words, about the possibility of finding a way forward without destroying what was left of her family. But could she really trust Serafina to keep her word? Do I have time to think about it? Livia asked. Talia nodded. The mediation is scheduled for next week. You have until then to decide. That evening, Livia found herself standing in the attic, surrounded by boxes of her mother's belongings. She hadn't been back up there since discovering the tin canister, and the sight of the dusty space brought a fresh wave of memories. She opened a box labeled Letters and pulled out a stack of envelopes, the handwriting instantly recognizable as her mother's. Livia sat on the floor, her fingers trembling as she opened the first letter. It was addressed to no one in particular, more of a journal entry than a correspondence. As she read, tears welled in her eyes. Her mother had written about her hopes for the future, her dreams of leaving something behind for her children and grandchildren. But there was also a sense of regret, a lingering sorrow over the fractures in their family. I wish I had been braver, Elara had written. I wish I had told them how much I loved them, even when it was hard. The words hit Livia like a punch to the gut. She had spent so much time fighting to protect her mother's legacy, but in doing so, she had only deepened the divisions Elara had wanted to heal. The next morning, Livia called Talia. Set up the mediation, she said, her voice steady. I'm ready to talk. The mediation took place in a small, windowless room at the courthouse. Livia sat at one end of the table, Talia beside her. Serafina and her lawyer, Kael Drake, sat at the other end. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence heavy with unspoken grievances. The mediator, a stern but fair-looking woman named Amara Wynne, began by outlining the rules. This is an opportunity for both parties to come to an agreement without the need for a trial. My role is to facilitate a productive conversation, not to take sides. Livia glanced at Serafina, who was staring at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For the first time, Livia saw something other than defiance in her daughter's expression. There was vulnerability, even fear. Amara turned to Livia. Ms. Cross, would you like to start? Livia took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I've spent my entire life trying to take care of this family, she said, her voice trembling. I took care of my mother when no one else would. I kept the house running, made sacrifices for Callan, and worked hard to give him a future. And now, I feel like all of that is being taken away from me. She looked directly at Serafina. I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, and I know I've made mistakes. But this money isn't just about me. It's about everything I've given up to keep this family together. Serafina looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. I'm not trying to take that away from you, Mom. I just want to feel like I matter, like I'm part of this family again. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. For a moment, Livia didn't know how to respond. She had spent so long seeing Serafina as an antagonist, an obstacle to overcome. But now, she saw her daughter for what she truly was, a person struggling to find her place in a fractured family. I don't want to keep fighting, Livia said finally, her voice soft. If this money can help us heal, then maybe it's time to stop seeing it as a prize to be won. Amara nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. It sounds like we're making progress. By the end of the mediation, Livia and Serafina had reached an agreement. The money would be split 60-40, with Livia keeping the larger share. More importantly, they agreed to work on rebuilding their relationship, starting with regular family dinners and open communication. As they left the courthouse, Livia turned to Serafina. "This doesn't fix everything," she said, "but it's a start." Serafina nodded, her expression hopeful. "I'll take a start over nothing." That night, Livia sat with Callan at the kitchen table, the tin canister now empty and tucked away in a closet. For the first time in weeks, the house felt lighter, as if a storm had finally passed. "Do you think Grandma would be proud?" Callan asked, his voice quiet. Livia smiled, her heart full of both sadness and relief. "I think she'd be happy we're finally trying to be a family again." The morning sun rose sluggishly, casting a dull light over Livia Cross's small living room. She sat at the table, the tin canister open in front of her. The stacks of cash inside had long lost their gleam in her eyes. They felt more like shackles than salvation now. She could feel Callan watching her from the kitchen doorway, his unspoken words weighing as heavily as her own thoughts. "Mom," he finally said, stepping closer, "have you thought about what you're going to do?" Livia closed the lid of the canister and rubbed her temples. "I don't know, Callan. I thought I was ready to fight this out in court, but now—" Her voice trailed off, thick with hesitation. Callan pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You don't have to decide today, but you need to ask yourself if this is worth it. Not just the money, everything that comes with it." Livia nodded, but didn't respond. Her thoughts were a storm of conflicting emotions. On one hand, the money represented years of sacrifice and struggle, a chance to finally give Callan the life he deserved. On the other hand, every step of this legal battle had driven a deeper wedge between her and Serafina, and the cost of that rift was becoming harder to ignore. When Livia arrived at Talia Moon's office later that day, her lawyer's usual air of confidence seemed tinged with caution. Talia gestured for Livia to sit, then slid a new document across the desk. "Serafina's team has proposed a mediation," Talia said, her tone neutral. "It's not a settlement, but it's a step in that direction. They're offering to split the money 70-30, with you keeping the larger share." Livia's eyes widened. 70-30? After everything they've put me through, they think I'll just hand over 30%? Talia raised a hand, her expression calm. "It's not ideal, but it's an opportunity to avoid a prolonged court battle. If we go to trial, you risk losing more than 30%. Judges can be unpredictable, especially without a will to back your claim." Livia stared at the document, her stomach churning. The idea of giving Serafina any of the money felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked for. But the thought of dragging the fight through court with no guarantee of victory was equally unappealing. "What happens if I refuse?" Livia asked. Talia sighed. "Then we go to trial as planned. But you need to understand, Serafina's team will come at you with everything they've got. They'll dig into your finances, your parenting, even your relationship with your mother. It won't be pretty." Livia leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She thought about Callan's words, about the possibility of finding a way forward without destroying what was left of her family. But could she really trust Serafina to keep her word? "Do I have time to think about it?" Livia asked. Talia nodded. "The mediation is scheduled for next week. You have until then to decide. Shit. That evening, Livia found herself standing in the attic, surrounded by boxes of her mother's belongings. She hadn't been back up there since discovering the tin canister, and the sight of the dusty space brought a fresh wave of memories. She opened a box labeled Letters and pulled out a stack of envelopes, the handwriting instantly recognizable as her mother's. Livia sat on the floor, her fingers trembling as she opened the first letter. It was addressed to no one in particular, more of a journal entry than a correspondence. As she read, tears welled in her eyes. Her mother had written about her hopes for the future, her dreams of leaving something behind for her children and grandchildren. But there was also a sense of regret, a lingering sorrow over the fractures in their family. I wish I had been braver, Alara had written. I wish I had told them how much I loved them, even when it was hard. The words hit Livia like a punch to the gut. She had spent so much time fighting to protect her mother's legacy, but in doing so, she had only deepened the divisions Alara had wanted to heal. The next morning, Livia called Talia. "Set up the mediation," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to talk." The mediation took place in a small, windowless room at the courthouse. Livia sat at one end of the table, Talia beside her. Serafina and her lawyer, Cale Drake, sat at the other end. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence heavy with unspoken grievances. The mediator, a stern but fair-looking woman named Amara Wynn, began by outlining the rules. This is an opportunity for both parties to come to an agreement without the need for a trial. My role is to facilitate a productive conversation, not to take sides. Livia glanced at Serafina, who was staring at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For the first time, Livia saw something other than defiance in her daughter's expression. There was vulnerability, even fear. Amara turned to Livia. "Miss Cross, would you like to start?" Livia took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I've spent my entire life trying to take care of this family," she said, her voice trembling. "I took care of my mother when no one else would. I kept the house running, made sacrifices for Callan, and worked hard to give him a future. And now, I feel like all of that is being taken away from me." She looked directly at Serafina. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, and I know I've made mistakes. But this money isn't just about me. It's about everything I've given up to keep this family together." Serafina looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'm not trying to take that away from you, Mom. I just want to feel like I matter, like I'm part of this family again." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. For a moment, Livia didn't know how to respond. She had spent so long seeing Serafina as an antagonist, an obstacle to overcome. But now, she saw her daughter for what she truly was, a person struggling to find her place in a fractured family. "I don't want to keep fighting," Livia said finally, her voice soft. "If this money can help us heal, then maybe it's time to stop seeing it as a prize to be won." Amara nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "It sounds like we're making progress." By the end of the mediation, Livia and Serafina had reached an agreement. The money would be split 60-40, with Livia keeping the larger share. More importantly, they agreed to work on rebuilding their relationship, starting with regular family dinners and open communication. As they left the courthouse, Livia turned to Serafina. "This doesn't fix everything," she said, But it's a start. Serafina nodded, her expression hopeful. I'll take a start over nothing. That night, Livia sat with Callan at the kitchen table, the tin canister now empty and tucked away in a closet. For the first time in weeks, the house felt lighter, as if a storm had finally passed. Do you think Grandma would be proud? Callan asked, his voice quiet. Livia smiled, her heart full of both sadness and relief. I think she'd be happy we're finally trying to be a family again. The uneasy truce between Livia Cross and her daughter Serafina Dawn held for a few days. The mediation had ended with a fragile agreement, and while they had both made promises to move forward, the bitterness of their past lingered beneath the surface. Livia tried to push through, hoping that the split of the money would close the chapter for good. But as the days went on, the weight of everything they hadn't said to each other began to crack the surface. It started with a simple question from Callan Frost. Sitting across the dinner table from Livia, he asked, Have you actually seen Serafina use the money yet? Livia frowned, setting down her fork. Why would that matter? It's her share now. She can do what she wants with it. Callan shrugged. I don't know. I just thought it was strange how quickly she backed off after the mediation. Like, she got what she wanted and disappeared again. Livia leaned back in her chair, her mind turning over the idea. It wasn't unusual for Serafina to retreat after a confrontation. That had always been her way. But something about Callan's observation stuck with her. They had agreed to meet weekly to rebuild their relationship, but Serafina hadn't reached out since the mediation. Livia hadn't either, too exhausted by the emotional toll of the past month. Yet the silence between them felt ominous. The following day, Livia decided to call Serafina. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. She left a message, trying to keep her tone casual. Hey, Serafina, just checking in. Let me know if you want to come over for dinner this week. The next morning, Livia received a response, not from Serafina, but from Cale Drake, her lawyer. His email was terse and to the point. My client is unable to meet at this time due to personal reasons. Any future communication should go through me. Livia's stomach tightened as she read the words. Why was Serafina suddenly cutting her off again? They had come so close to finding common ground, and now it felt as though the mediation had been nothing more than a temporary reprieve. She forwarded the email to Talia Moon, her own lawyer, with a note. Something feels off. What do you think this means? Talia responded quickly. It's hard to say. It could be nothing, but it's worth keeping an eye on. Let me know if you hear anything else. Livia spent the rest of the day trying to distract herself, but her mind kept drifting back to the money. Had she been too quick to trust Serafina? The thought made her stomach churn. She hated feeling paranoid, but after everything they had been through, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. That evening, Callan returned home from class with a stack of papers in hand. He dropped them on the kitchen counter and looked at Livia. You're not going to like this, he said. Livia picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the text. They were copies of public records, deeds, financial filings, and legal documents, all linked to Serafina. As she flipped through them, her chest tightened. Among the documents was a recent purchase agreement for a downtown office building, signed by Serafina and funded partially by a loan secured against her portion of the inheritance. She bought a building? Livia asked, her voice rising in disbelief. Not just any building, Callan said. It's part of a development project that's been stalled for years. She's betting everything on turning it around. If it works, she'll make a fortune. If it doesn't, she loses everything, Livia finished, her stomach sinking. Including the family money. Callan nodded. I don't think she plans on coming back to the family, Mom. I think she's using this as her way out. Livia's hands shook as she set the papers down. She felt a wave of anger and betrayal wash over her. After all the fighting, after all the promises to rebuild their relationship, Serafina had used her share of the money to fund a risky business venture without so much as a word to Livia. She's cutting ties, Livia said quietly. She got what she wanted, and now she's gone. Callan placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't know that for sure. Maybe she thinks this is her way of proving herself, of showing she can succeed without the family. Or maybe she just doesn't care, Livia said, her voice bitter. Maybe she never cared. Livia spent the next few days in a fog, her mind consumed by thoughts of Serafina's betrayal. She tried to focus on her work, on Callan, on anything other than the growing rift between her and her daughter. But the questions kept coming, each one more painful than the last. Had she been wrong to trust Serafina? Had the mediation been a mistake? Finally, she decided to confront Serafina directly. She drove to the address listed on the purchase agreement, a rundown office building in the heart of downtown. The neighborhood was in the early stages of gentrification, with a mix of trendy cafes and boarded-up storefronts lining the streets. Livia parked her car and approached the building, her heart pounding. The front door was unlocked, and she stepped inside, the smell of dust and mildew filling her nose. The lobby was empty, the walls covered in peeling paint. Livia heard voices coming from one of the upper floors and followed the sound, her footsteps echoing in the quiet space. She found Serafina in a large, empty room, standing with a group of people and gesturing toward a set of blueprints spread out on a table. Serafina looked confident, in her element, as she explained her vision for the building. Livia felt a pang of sadness as she watched her daughter. This was a side of Serafina she hadn't seen in years, a side she barely recognized. When the meeting ended and the group began to disperse, Livia stepped forward. Serafina, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. Serafina turned, her expression hardening when she saw Livia. What are you doing here? We need to talk, Livia said, crossing the room. I know what you've been doing with the money, Serafina sighed, rubbing her temples. Of course you do. You always have to know everything, don't you? This isn't about control, Livia said, her voice trembling. This is about trust. We agreed to rebuild our relationship, to try and move forward. And now I find out you've been using the money for some risky business venture without even telling me? Serafina folded her arms, her expression defensive. I don't owe you an explanation, Mom. It's my money. I can do whatever I want with it. But this isn't just about the money, Livia said, her voice rising. This is about us, about this family. I thought we were finally starting to fix things, but now it feels like you've just been playing me. Serafina's face softened, but her tone remained guarded. I'm not playing you, Mom. I'm trying to build something for myself. Something that isn't tied to you or Grandma or this family's history. I'm trying to move forward, and this is the only way I know how. Livia took a step closer, her voice trembling. But why does moving forward mean leaving us behind? Serafina didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the floor. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of their shared pain filling the space. Finally, Livia spoke, her voice soft. I don't want to lose you, Serafina, but I can't keep fighting for someone who doesn't want to be part of this family. Serafina looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Maybe I don't know how to be part of this family, she said quietly. Maybe I never did. Livia felt her heart break at the words, but she nodded. Then maybe it's time we figure it out. Together. The silence in the room was suffocating as Livia Cross stood across from her daughter, Serafina Dawn. Their years of unresolved pain finally laid bare. The empty office space around them seemed to echo their tension, but for the first time in years, there was no anger in their voices, just raw, unfiltered truth. Serafina wiped her eyes, the facade of defiance crumbling. "I don't know if I can be the daughter you want, Mom. I don't know if I'll ever be enough." Livia stepped forward, her voice steady but soft. "You were never supposed to be perfect, Serafina. I just wanted you to try, to not give up on this family, on us." Serafina met her mother's gaze, searching for the forgiveness she had been too afraid to ask for. "I want to fix this, but I don't know how." "We start small," Livia said, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "One step at a time. No more running, no more secrets. If you fall, I'll be here. That's what family does." For the first time, Serafina smiled back. It was tentative, like a fragile truce, but it was a start. The money, the fights, the legal battles, all of it seemed trivial compared to the bridge they had just begun to rebuild. Weeks later, Livia and Serafina met for dinner at Livia's home, joined by Callan Frost. The air was lighter, the conversation cautious but hopeful. Serafina shared her plans for the building, and for once, Livia listened without judgment. She could see the determination in her daughter's eyes. The same fire that had once driven their fights now channeled into something constructive. The scars of their past weren't gone, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Together, they were learning to be a family again, one day at a time. As the evening drew to a close, Livia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Maybe the money had torn them apart, but it had also forced them to confront the fractures in their relationship. In its wake, they had found something far more valuable: each other. You've made it to the end. If you enjoyed this story, I am confident that you'll love the next one appearing on the screen now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and please give this video a like. I'll see you in the next one.